Well, Nick, welcome back to Disclosure Team. Really excited to have you back to discuss what we're going to talk about today. But first things first, how have you been?
I've been good, man. It's great to be here. Thank you so much for having me. I'm kind of excited about what we're talking about today. I have been online a little bit for the last couple of weeks. Caught me by surprise, so it'll be really interesting to cover this today and then, get feedback from people who are watching.
Yeah, and it's not that often we get this kind of document release. So, when I first saw it, I thought, this is something significant, even though, like a lot of things we've had historically, it is heavily redacted. But personally, it does give us little kind of insights into the way things may have worked with regards to the UAP task force. So before we jump into the document, why don't you give me kind of some of your thoughts initially on what you kind of got from the document?
Well, so this relates to the work of the UAP task force. And just to remind people, between the time that OSAP and then the kind of Lou Elizondo's continuance of that work under kind of the ATIP moniker at DIA. So when that wound down and they weren't able to successfully get the Department of Homeland Security, DHS, to pick up kind of that work under the Kona Blue project, a number of years went by. And then this thing called the UAP task force, which it's kind of my understanding, and you may have heard this as well, Vinnie. I guess it had worked a little less officially. It was kind of like a working group on one of these, closed classified networks. They use Microsoft SharePoint and other kind of they kind of have their own social media and file sharing capabilities on those systems. And there had been kind of a community of interest, this UAP task force. I don't know if it was even going by that name at that point, of just people kind of analyzing interesting data that was coming in on the UAP topic. There kind of continued to be some interest in that. And then what happened in the FY21, I think it was, Intelligence Authorization Act, which gets folded into the NDA, the National Defense Authorization Act, every year. Marco Rubio that year, this kind of kicked off the kind of current UAP legislation cycle we're in now. Marco Rubio slipped something in the IAA, I think it was Rubio, and it called for essentially a report on UAP to be produced by DoD and the intelligence community. And that led to the final report that was issued in 2021 by this thing called the UAP Task Force, which represented kind of the first government assessment put out in the both open realm, and there was also classified version, which we're going to be talking about today to some degree. But they started this cycle now that we've seen annually of what's evolved into the Aero office, which kind of came together after the UAP task force. In some way, it sort of evolved into Aero. I don't know if there was personnel in common. We do kind of know that it looks like Aero's new director, John Kozlowski, Dr. Kozlowski, I think he was in the UAP task force. He was an NSA guy who was doing work with them. So that's an interesting thing, and I think why some people may be a little more positive about him, because it seems like the UAPTF, as it went by, again, under Jay Stratton, who had also had associations with the OSAP program and has known Lou Elizondo and the other people, and Lakatsky and all those people, Kelleher, who were involved with OSAP. Stratton was at the helm of this UAP task force. It operated, it's a little not totally clear to me, but it was definitely operating in 2020 and 2021. And they were kind of, starting to do the work that evolved into the work that's now been mandated by Congress, but is what Aero has kind of taken up. But, that first UAPTF report that came out, I think, in 2021, it gave us a little more in some ways than what the last couple of years of Aero reports have given us. It spoke a little more to some of the outlier cases and things like that, the kind of anomalous aspect, whereas Aero, brushed a little bit of that under the rug. So the workings of the UAPTF have always been kind of interesting to people who follow this, because it's like, okay, this was an official IC cross-agency working group where they seem to be taking the UAP topic, especially the outliers, pretty seriously. We understand through people like Sarah Gam, who did some analysis work for UAPTF, she was just kind of doing a subset of analyzing particular types of imagery, various stuff. She mentioned actually SAR, synthetic aperture radar, I believe, in a recent interview. So she had a certain set of things that she was a specialist in, and would get that just kind of to do some of the duties of the analytical work of the UAPTF. I didn't get the sense from her that she was necessarily kind of in the management of this project or anything. That was really Jay Stratton's role, and it reported up to naval intelligence, actually, even though it was a cross-agency working group. So that was the UAPTF. It kind of evolved into Aero. People may remember from my website, Declassify UAP, and a lot of the messaging that I've been putting out over the last now a little over a year publicly on behalf of Declassify UAP. I set up on that website, I laid out, I think it was 7 what I called declassification targets. These were tangible, specific types, classes of information that we would ideally see some transparency around and further declassification of. It has UAP, rich media that shows UAP more clearly than some of the stuff we have. What we know, they have HD and even 4K cameras or much higher quality FLIR. Again, released in a way that preserves national security interests, but we know they release that stuff in many other circumstances. It just doesn't happen to be UAP related. So there seems to be some games being played about this sources and methods is the reason we can't see that. And then I had other things, summaries of sensor data that and what it was seeing, because they've said this is stuff we're capturing on other types of systems. It could be radar, it could be overhead imagery from satellites. It's like, give us at least the story of what some of that is indicating if you can't give us the actual data set and the information on the platform. That's all very classified stuff. I get it. But you can kind of describe what its findings are, right? Like, well, we saw some stuff that kind of did some stuff like this, and that was very abnormal, and we picked it up on this kind of stuff. They give us that with some things. Well, I laid out a number of the other ones, and one of them, and it's always been a real focus of mine, is intelligence assessments, right? Because maybe, I don't know, folks follow the, intelligence community variously. Some people know about it more than others. But, one of the big things that realm does is they generate various types of work products, including intelligence assessments. This is what we're finding. Here's some of the information we've been able to pull up. And we see these things sometimes. And we even see kind of like controversial ones or ones that have been obfuscated a little bit come out into the public light. I'll give just an example. We saw the COVID origin intelligence assessments become declassified and presented to the public that revealed that a number of the agencies of the US intelligence community absolutely, in fact, I think they almost all took seriously the possibility that the so-called lab leak in Wuhan was potentially behind the COVID pandemic. Which was not the public messaging at all. But ODNI, which is the Director of National Intelligence's office, they ostensibly sit on top of the IC. I say ostensibly because there still seems to be a schism between their operations and IC agencies that are run by DoD, which is most of the IC agencies are a huge. NSA is really a DoD agency. DIA is really a DoD agency. NRO is really a DoD agency. So there still seems to be a little bit of the DoD and then more like spookish spy people divide in the IC realm. But ODNI kind of put out that COVID origin thing. They just simply summarized the findings of some of the agencies, and they acknowledged to the public that they really did take this lab leak thing very seriously. And while they don't have a final answer on it, it's kind of very much on the table, which is kind of a crazy thing. So ODNI releases these periodically. You can go to the ODNI website, and they have a number of reports that they put out, and some of them end up being sort of made public versions of internal intelligence assessments. We've seen some other ones with kind of the anomalous health incidents, the Havana syndrome, so to speak, and they've been releasing a little more information about even just their investigation of it, even if they haven't acknowledged anyway that they find something really behind that right now. They have been making some of their research into that a little more public. So intelligence assessments is like one of the main things you're putting together when you work for the IC. I mean, you have all the tools and the human intelligence and the sensor platforms, the ISR, the surveillance and reconnaissance platforms. You have all of this stuff, but at the end of the day, you're really like needing to summarize things for both DoD leaders and the executive branch leaders up to the president. ODNI prepares the daily IC, intelligence briefing for the president. It's kind of consolidated from the work of all the agencies. So one presumes that somewhere along the way, whether it was in the more distant past or more recently, someone in the IC and or DoD produced some intelligence assessments on UAP. And I called that out as one of the declassification targets that we got to like push for, because that could be a lower hanging fruit. We talk about this legacy program. We talk about things buried, the Indiana Jones warehouse that no one can get into, whatever it is. There's that realm of this, which I think there's could well be something to that, right? But we know there's sort of in the OSAP, ATIP, and since period, there's been this other level of government, DoD, IC activity around UFOs. And it seems like a little more accessible because it's like officially acknowledged stuff that we have information about, like the UAPTF and now the Aero Office. So, you'll remember, Vinny, a few weeks ago when Lou was doing his tour for Imminent, and you had one of the very first interviews with him. You had audience Q&A, and you were kind enough to read mine. And at the time, my question for Lou was, are you even aware of such intelligence assessments that have been generated by any DoD or IC agency concerning the ultimate nature and origin of UAP and what those possibilities are assessed to be based on currently available information? And he gave a really funny answer. He was kind of more awkward than I typically see Lou, adjusting his hat. He goes, "That's a really great question." He's like, "I need to get back to you on it and talk to someone and see if I can even answer that question." Well, this is what happened. Within a couple of weeks, and this happened on October 10th, of that question even being asked, and I'm not saying this was connected, but it just so happened that a couple of Black Vault, John Greenwald FOIA requests, one that was put in 21 and one that was put in 22, so we're talking several years old, happened to get returns. And they covered to some degree intelligence assessments specifically done and briefed to other agencies by the UAP task force. And it's funny, I missed it when it was first announced. I had been out of my house doing something that day, and I came back, and I mentioned intelligence assessments once in a while, and someone on X was like, "It came out." I was like, "What are you talking about?" I was like, "What?" They're like, "No, check it out. It's on the Black Vault." I was like, and I found what we're going to just take a quick look at right now, thanks to John Greenwald's FOIA work. And it kind of consolidated two FOIA requests that he had put in. You can see what looks like a very official DoD letterhead, correct?
Yes, absolutely.
So, when you do a FOIA request, you maintain communications with the agency and their FOIA group. And these are the letters that John got back relating to what was a Navy FOIA, because again, UAPTF rolled up to naval intelligence. This was run by the fellow Scott Bray, who testified in the 2022 House hearing and said something very interesting about the Tic Tac incident when he was asked about whether there's any non-human or unnatural examples of UAP. And Scott Bray, who ran naval intelligence at the time, and Jay Stratton reported up to him, was like, "Well, I think everyone's familiar with the 2004 Nimitz incident," referring to the Tic Tac. He goes, we have data on that, and it remains very difficult to understand. And he's like, "It's unresolved." And so it's like, well, one would think that like naval intelligence or someone maybe did an intelligence assessment on what that thing might have been representative of. It's kind of ridiculous to think that the IC didn't mull that over, right? It's just ridiculous. So John got both some communications. This is an email thread. It looks like it's between Jay Stratton and a contact at NASA. I believe this may be the man, I'm forgetting his name offhand, who ended up kind of taking over the NASA UAP role. And it turned out that he had been NASA's kind of DoD liaison on UAP. So this might have been to him, possibly. It's from Jay Stratton. One of those letters mentions that this was prepared by Jay Stratton on behalf of UAPTF and briefed to both NASA, specifically the UAP person who apparently had clearance to see this, but also potentially other agencies and groups. So I think we can think of this thing, which is now on screen, the cover, as at least as of the 31st of August, 2020, which they had not wrapped up their operations at this point and kind of turned, Arrow supplanted them. This was still kind of when they were going. And again, maybe even incorporated some intelligence that the group had been doing a little more loosely in the time leading up to this. The blackout in the middle, Director UAPTF, is Jay. Why that was still needed to be classified when even the FOIA response says it was prepared by Jay Stratton and briefed by Jay Stratton, it's a little strange. It makes you wonder why some of these exemptions are even in place. Now, this is an interesting one before we get into the meat of it, and which is pretty quick because most of it is redacted. It's interesting to note that the overall classification of the briefing is itself classified or redacted. They say redacted and the classification being redacted. It to me speaks to there probably being a particular code word associated with the intelligence that's contained within this UAP briefing assembled by UAPTF under naval intelligence. Because remember, the Nimitz incident, the incidents that Ryan Graves spoke to in 2015 off the East Coast, these are Navy aviators. So naval intelligence is all over this. That's why we're talking about the Navy in the water, if anyone was curious, because this is obviously stuff in the sky that they're mostly seeing, maybe not entirely. But there's some code word here, I think. Probably an SCI compartment, sensitive compartmented information, might just mean that some code word was associated with this particular briefing and the kind of class of information that's contained therein. It would be really interesting to know what that kind of program or activity compartment is called. I'm not saying anyone should just leak it or whatever, but it's interesting. Like, this is still clearly on lockdown as of today, and this again came out on October 10th, as when these FOIA returns came back from 2021 and 2022. So this is just a quick overview of the UAPTF program. Interesting stuff, safety of flight, national security, although they're not really telling us why it's a national security concern. That's blacked out. I like this, standardize and destigmatize reporting. Is what many people wanted to see the government do, but at a level of more normal operations and not sketchy ways. Like, this is how they actually tend to do these things. So this lays out the program. Stigmas associated. It's interesting. One of the stigmas they don't even want to speak to in this. It's blacked out with a B1 exemption. And these exemptions mean different things, but if I'm remembering correctly, B1 is maybe just like this blanket kind of National Security Act thing. It's like, well, we can kind of just classify anything we want. Interestingly, one of the IC agencies that participated has an exemption, a redaction over it. It doesn't look like that's 4 letters. It looks like that's 3 shorter letters. Maybe it means that one of them is an I, and I wouldn't be so shocked if the first one began with the letter C, but that's just my best guess, honestly. But I wouldn't be surprised if that was the CIA. Could be someone else, and they just didn't feel comfortable speaking to it. But you've got NRO, which
would NSA fall under that? Oh, it's there. I see it. Sorry, I do see it now. That's right there.
So just to go through, NASIC is sort of I think the naval intelligence stuff.
It must be CIA then, surely.
I think so. Defense Intelligence Agency. Again, these are all DoD members of the IC. So, I get this vibe sometimes from ODNI that it's like they do take responsibility and consider within their auspices the work of the intelligence community. That's really these DoD agencies when they want to and it's convenient for them. And when it's inconvenient, they're like, oh no, that's the DoD and not us. It's like, you run the IC. That's all of these agencies. Like, these guys are all in the IC. And then there's this section of participants. It mentions industry and academia, which implies they at least had plans to outreach into that realm. And we know that Jay has done that over the years. Various like UAP science groups and stuff like that. This whole section is blacked out, which is interesting. And sadly, this is what most of the report looks like. We have the heading on this page, reported sightings of UAP, but then whatever, and then whatever, an entire page of information. It could be imagery, it could be text, it's probably a mixture. They just throw the black mark over the whole thing. We do see that they had an entire page on the Tic Tac Nimitz incident from 2004 that, again, Bray and others have spoken to, and we have the FLIR video and all of this. This is Dave Fravor. and Alex Dietrich and Kevin Day on radar on the Princeton. We all know this incident, even as Scott Bray said. I think people are very familiar with it, speaking to like, yeah, you understand it kind of as we do. That's kind of how I interpret that statement that he made to Congress. Interesting, it says there was very limited data to support technical analysis. That might be true. We have heard that the tapes from the radar system, which might be more interesting than anything else. Fravor has said that he is not aware of any more video of this incident. It might have been a little clearer in the originals. You could see the little feet sticking off the bottom of the Tic Tac thing more, but he's not aware of like a much longer clip or anything. But there has been some reporting that radar data, probably off of the Princeton, might have gotten taken away. So is that limited data because someone siphoned it up, or there just wasn't any captured? Who knows? Doesn't seem like these guys necessarily had access to it wherever it ended up. This is interesting. Pilot reporting, and then whatever. Says air crews see the UAP. In this case, they photographed the UAP. Now, this could be a reference to what we know has happened, and we've even seen some of these images, air crew using like their own personal smartphone devices and such, and shooting out of the canopy and catching UAP. Now, because again, jets don't photograph things really, they shoot video. This specifically uses the nomenclature photographed. So it's making me think like, oh, like we saw from the Chinese spy balloon when that was recovered before they shot it down, that one of the U-2 pilots took a selfie from the U-2 spy plane looking down, because those things go so high, over the Chinese spy balloon. So they can capture stuff doing this with their own devices, and for some reason these devices, at least up until recently, were allowed in the cockpit. So this wouldn't be, if it is that kind of a thing, there's no sources and methods. We know what the iPhone does, and et cetera. So or the Samsung device, its phone is not a classified platform, or its camera rather. So maybe, I think this might be some of that stuff, possibly. This whole page is blacked out. We don't even have the heading on this one. This is a lot of this is blacked out, but we obviously see the 2015 gimbal video. It's rotating. With the statement, it's a powerful one. UAP are not easily explainable, can quickly overwhelm our air crew. And we've seen this in some of the tapes, the two of the FLIR videos that we've seen that have audio. They're like, oh man, you got it. Like they're clearly fixated on it and even trying to capture it. Like it's become the focus of their attention. And if that's not something relating to the operations that they're supposed to be maintaining, especially if that was in theater or in the middle of a dogfight, whatever it could be, that's a real problem. We know that these range fouler incidents, as they call them, when the test range is fouled by the presence of something that's not supposed to be there, they have had to scramble entire training operations because of UFOs. So it's an interesting acknowledgement. I'm glad we at least got this declassified. Now, this says multiple sensors worldwide reporting. So it's a little difficult to know what's in those blacked out 3. In the upper right-hand corner, we have one of the classic green triangles. Seems a little like non-resolved, no pun intended, as to whether that's actually an artifact of the aperture and the bokeh effect, or whether it might actually be a triangular thing. Regardless of that, it seems some people still really do believe these green triangle, night vision thing incidents were still anomalous because of the nature of the drone swarm and how long they loitered, and the fact that they couldn't trace them back to anything in many cases, including nearby boats. It almost reminds me of what we've heard about more recently in the Langley, Virginia Air Base drone incursions that they couldn't really nail down. So that's shown to us, presumably because we've seen a bit of that already. I think we've seen multiple recordings that kind of look like the green triangles. Whether these other ones are blacked out data, it does say multiple sensors. So maybe this is not FLIR in the upper right. So maybe some of these are FLIR, maybe some of these are plain video, just optical bandwidth range. So they don't want to show us a lot of these things, clearly. And they usually show us what these sensors can capture. I mean, these are some of these are older now too. So another total page we can't see. But this right here, really caught my attention, Vinny. So the UAPTF has collected however many reports dated from the last however many years, and it's unfortunate that they wouldn't even speak to what time frame the group's data set involved and how many encounters. That seems a little silly. I mean, we're getting that from says more than half have been detected by multiple sensors. Speaks to these things, maybe on radar and a FLIR camera, which we know has happened. That was sort of the gimbal incident. These things were on the radar. It doesn't seem like it was a glare. And it wasn't behaving like another aircraft in the range that they just weren't aware of for whatever reason. I mean, these are very controlled airspaces, but this seems to confirm that these things are real objects. In many cases, they know that to be true. And then in the upper right here, potential explanations. It's like the current assessment on UFOs and an official naval intelligence report with a little section above and potential explanations, and two of the three are classified. And number two, which we get, unknown weather or other natural phenomena, which is like the old standby that people were saying in like the 60s or even much earlier than the 60s. And, no one's ever found real evidence for that. But hey, let's throw it in there. Maybe we don't know about something really weird in our natural environment, in the atmosphere. James McDonald, who people will be familiar with, is one of the first UAP scientists. He was an atmospheric specialist. He was an atmospheric physicist. He was exceptionally well regarded at the national and international level. I think he was at University of Arizona. And it's like, he didn't back then have any frame of reference for unknown weather events. But anyway, throw it on. Why not? Maybe it softens the blow from the other two that we're not allowed to know what they are. Like, what do you think they are, Vinny? I mean, I'm curious just what this speaks to you.
I mean, what I find interesting is that the classification blackout is different on each one. We've got B1, but then B5 for B5 for number 3, which raises the question: well, why are they both not B1 or B5? That's where I go to. I mean, I could speculate all day long on what the other two could be. We know from the other assessments than the things that have been released that they generally have a list of about 4 or 5 potential explanations for UAP, and well, usually 4, because the 5th is always other, usually. So I don't really know, and I do tend to kind of take a step back from speculating too much. But
Well, I mean, here's what I'll say though. Let's think about this a moment. That frame of reference we know at least came into existence. Those categories, those actually were UAPTF categories, if I remember correctly, because when that first public report from UAPTF came out in middle of 21, that's the one that laid out that schema, those classification categories. Um, and it included like the seagulls and the balloons and the censored anomalies and, yeah, I mean, refuse in the sky, garbage bag blowing around or whatever, right? um it was a different schema. It, as you just said, it had like 5 categories and one was other. Now let's think about this for a moment. This whole report that we just went through really doesn't seem like it's about the like mistaken balloons, right? Like, just nothing about seeming like it's that. I mean, it's like they're not easily explainable and can overwhelm. And they show an example of like what kind of looks like a UFO doing weird UFO stuff in their own briefing document, which seems to think that naval intelligence did not think that this was glare off of the back of a jet, right? Um, so they seem to be focusing on the other unresolved, more outlier examples in this presentation. I mean, whether these green triangles, oh, I passed it, are drones or some other capability, and it's not aliens or future folk or reptoids from the inner Earth, whatever. Like, it's still seemingly representing an anomaly to them, and this seems to be a report about the anomalies, and like the not possible seagull anomalies, like actual weird things that they're like, we don't know what we're dealing with here. And so when I look at these 3 potential explanations, I at least interpret that based on like the gaps that I'm seeing, because we're not getting much info here. But like based on kind of squinting your eyes, I see this as more like, what are these weird ones? What are these ones that like are really making us scratch our head? And what are, like, I think this could represent, I'm not saying it even one of these is aliens or ET or non-human intelligence technosignature or any of that stuff. I mean, it could be more banal. One of it could be like some breakthrough adversarial technology, or something like that. Heck, that might be a good thing to have as a possibility. Like maybe someone just leapfrogged us. Might want to least, but these are the people who know that. Like they do intelligence on foreign nations' capabilities. So maybe they keep that in play. Maybe they've ruled that out. It's hard to say. Um, they may have reasons to think that some of what they're seeing is not that stuff based on other intelligence that they do is just part of their daily operations. I don't know. But let's say something's even slightly interesting is behind here. I mean, again, let's go back to what members of the UAPTF have said in public. David Grush, member of the UAPTF, was the main NRO and I think mostly NGA guy reporting in that org chart that we looked at earlier, that list of agencies. We know what David Grush has said. Carl Nell, I believe, was on the UAPTF. Saw this stuff, presumably, or various subsets or bigger collections, without the black marks over them. We know what Carl Nell has said, no doubt, no doubt. You know what Sarah Gam has said? Yeah, some of these things are not us. There was a big brain thing flying around and it was changing shapes and things. Like, I mean, it was not an airplane and not a balloon, probably. So, members of this very organization are quite on the record at this point in several interesting ways and in circumstances, like speaking to like there is some other thing involved with this UAP stuff. It's not us, speaking broadly of like known human society. So we have to keep in the just set of possibilities that there might be something kind of interesting under one or both of those blacked out marks. And I think we deserve to kind of know it if it looks like a several word summary, right? I don't think it's probably referring like we think it's the Russian blah 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 blah. It could be like if that's a top secret thing, I want it to probably stay top secret if they feel that's for the best interest of U.S. national security. I get it, but like number two is weather phenomena. They seem to be like throwing out ideas like what is this weird stuff that we keep encountering that's not making any sense. And based on what UAPTF members have said, including Jay himself, Jay was his life and his experiences were covered quite heavily in a couple of books, including Skinwalkers at the Pentagon. We learned that he was one of the main OSAP people involved with that whole thing. It stands to reason that maybe there's something interesting here. And I think we don't get, as you said earlier, we don't get this kind of document very often. Oh, and by the way, there's a plan of action and milestones. Whether or not these ever were even carried out as UAPTF evolved into Arrow, who knows? And then, of course, the questions page, and it's like, yeah, I've got questions. I've got a lot of questions. So I'll stop sharing for a second here, and I just think it's a really interesting thing because we now have a very tangible, very recent, 4 years ago, and they were operating well into 21, issuing other reports. Very tangible intelligence assessment that the UAPTF under naval intelligence, looking at all these incidents in the more recent time frame, last 20 years of kind of naval incidents between the Tic Tac and the cubes and spheres and whatever it might be. This kind of represents their thinking on it. And we now have that to wave around. And I'll tell you, I've been using this in some of my advocacy efforts. For instance, making sure a lot of key congressional offices and the key staff that are looking at the UAP issue in those offices know about this thing. I changed the campaign on declassifyuap.org. I hope all the listeners go to it. The campaign message that you send now, and even if you've sent it before, you can send it again if a little time has gone by. I mention now this UAPTF intelligence assessment and that it's a good example of the kind of thing that should be more further declassified. So this gives us a tangible to wave around. And I mean, can you even think of any other like intelligence community UFO assessments? Like there's the estimate of the situation, which is almost more mythic at this point.
Exactly. No, I can't. And that's what I mean. Like we've had these reports that have come out almost annually now through RO and then back to the preliminary assessment in June 2021, but nothing of this type really in recent years. So it is. That's why I saw that you latched onto this and you've been asking questions about this. Hence why I asked Luke, because I thought it was a very important question. So I've had my eye out for these kind of things as well, and obviously as has John Greenwald. So I think they're very important, even if it doesn't tell us much. It gives us some. It paints a picture of its own to some degree. But my question now would be, since this has come out, we've heard of these legacy program and this immaculate constellation. Can you tie that to this in any way, shape, or form?
There's been a lot of chatter about this immaculate constellation thing, which I'll say, like, that's very long. That's a lot of syllables for a program name. You don't tend to run into program names that are such a mouthful, 2 4-syllable words. Some operations sound more like that. Maybe it was a type of operation. I can't say. We don't really
Or
have
an
any.
umbrella program,
Yeah,
broad
but like
with.
even just the name, it's not how you would typically like. There's actually naming convention protocols for how you come up with, because someone needs to manage all of the classified code words. And even if it's a SAP or a USAP, you still have code words associated with these things, I imagine, in many circumstances. And 2 4-syllable words isn't really adhering to like the typical way that those are assigned. So anyway, let's say there is this thing. What Schellenberger's source claimed in the article, the actual Schellenberger article that he put out, it was only a very small number of the words in that entire article related to the Immaculate Constellation. It was like sandwiched between a lot of other just more general background, which is fine. But the little bit we got was that it was created in 2017 and that it was to wrap up intelligence gathering and data gathering operations relating to UAP and kind of like firewalling them behind something and wrapping together different efforts. It didn't say that Immaculate Constellation is the legacy program. In fact, it kind of said the opposite. It said it was a relatively recent program to kind of consolidate and capture UAP data across apparently the DoD and IC and kind of keep it behind a certain firewall. Now, what's interesting is if that was 2017 that supposedly started, UAPTF kind of seems like it may have been going in some capacity then, and certainly going in a more official capacity just in several years after. They were able to get data. Sarah Gem said she was not familiar with Immaculate Constellation. Presumably, she was read into whatever she needed to be read into to like analyze UAP data. Maybe whatever that code word is on the front of this UAPTF document. I'm not sure, but whatever those analysts needed, they got access to. It doesn't sound like they were like they had a lot of stuff coming in. It is the sense I get. A relative, not all of it ended up being totally crazy, but like I don't get the sense that UAPTF was running into someone else's vacuuming up operation that had only just begun in 2017, is I guess what I'm saying.
Well, I think we kind of it almost points to that by the way we know how David Grush had to go and really dig deep and do his own detective work to go and find the things he claims to have found. It wasn't like they were bumping into it. He had to go and find it like it was totally separate.
Yeah, and the other possibility is that whatever Schellenberger's source is talking about, because they kind of claim they bumped into this information, like which is really weird if it's really a USAP. Like, how are you gonna? Well, these are really like guns in your face type operations, like literally. How you would bump into all this amazing data about this like UFO program that represents a true like SAP level. I mean, even UAPTF wasn't an SAP, I don't believe.
No, I don't
I don't
think
get
so.
this. It was a SAP. So, like, if did those people see a sign of some other thing that they were bumping up against? I haven't gotten that impression from anything that they've really said blatantly. It's more like no, they looked and they found. Um, so there is a chance that Immaculate Constellation relates to the activities of the UAPTF itself. Could it have been if it even was anything, which we don't know at this point? Again, there's no solid evidence that it was specifically a thing. But if the allegation bears out, could that have been like the gathering operation that UAPTF put into place to start to gather materials for their own analytic work, which was kicking up and becoming more official through naval intelligence? So maybe there's actually a relationship there. And, again, the names are a little less important. It's more important to understand like who was doing it and what was their function and how did it relate to other groups of people doing that stuff. Because the IC is big and they're all working with one another. I mean, it's always like, well, some NSA guy and the NRO guy and and like, I mean, it's stovepiped, but there's a lot of interagency stuff that has to happen when you're doing national level intelligence, right? So it's just an interesting open question. Maybe we'll learn more about this in the hearings. If someone brings up this immaculate constellation, or maybe brings up this UAPTF intelligence assessment. Again, I've made sure some of the offices that I think are attached to this issue seriously know about the document, know that the public would love to know what naval intelligence thought the crazy UFOs might be. Like, we seem to probably deserve it at this point. So hopefully we get a little pushing for that in the near future.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, listen, Nick, I mean, if there's nothing else you think that we need to cover, I mean, we kind of did because most of it was redacted. And I seriously really appreciate you coming on and sort of breaking that down. And I think it was kind of overlooked. And so hopefully this will just
Well,
bump a
it's
few
really
people.
interesting, Vinny. The Immaculate Constellation story came out days before this UAPTF report came out. And it got a lot of attention and it was a lot of the buzz. And that's interesting. Purely mode like open thinking hypothesis, keep it as a set of possibilities, but not I'm not saying this happened. But we have seen preemptive actions take place by people like Kirkpatrick and others leading up to something else happening, like a hearing or a statement or a book being released, like to get ahead of the story a little bit. And like sometimes it seems like to distract with a shiny object. And when we don't have solid information like a UAPTF intelligence assessment that I can wave around and we can go through like we just did, like that's tangible. We know that's real. We know that's real. Um, with anything else, we need to just always keep the possibility open that us hearing about something in a certain way could be a disinformation effort or could just be confusion and what is misinformation, something that someone is interpreting in a particular way. They didn't have the full context to kind of even make sense of what they were coming across, and they may have kind of given their own character to it. We just have to keep all of it in play, but that's why the tangible items are so useful, because we can go to them and point to them and bring them to our congressman's attention and say, you should probably know what's in this. You sit on, the flight safety subcommittee of FAA activities, and why aren't you being briefed on what these crazy UAP might be? And get them to take an interest in it, especially anyone in the intel committees, anyone on the armed services committees, any one of those reps on the Senate or House side. It's like you can send them this doc, you can engage with their office, you can find out who their kind of DOD, legislative affairs person is, and get into a dialogue and say, hey, you should take a look at this. Did you guys get this information? Do you know what these three possibilities for the crazy UFOs are? And the more eyes we can get on that, and the more people poking, our elected officials poking at it, and the more we let them know we know, like, it would be interesting if someone were to ask John Kozlowski about this intelligence. He was he seems to bridge the gap between UAPTF and Aero now. It's like, what are these assessments? Are you aware of this? Why is this secret? So these are real levers and buttons that we can press as we kind of try to engage with just the realms of officialdom and these agencies. And it's a really good tool. So we have this now. It's out there. I appreciate Greenwald doing this FOIA work and getting a hold of such things because they're critical in this. And, let's use it for all it's worth.
Yeah, absolutely. Once again, thank you so much for joining us. You are going to be attending the hearing on November 13th, and I know you were going to do a show on that, so it'd be great to have you back again. But I will leave links in the description as well, one for the document that we just went through, but also for Declassify UAP. And yeah, I mean, really interesting stuff, Nick. Thank you so much for being here.
Thank you. Sorry we went a little long, but, it's interesting stuff.
Absolutely, no problem at all. Thank you to everyone watching. Please go and check out the documents and check out Declassify UAP. Your voice can still make a difference in this subject. So please put it to good use. But for now, we'll see you soon. Take care.